This year, RockShox has made a lot of improvements to their entire suspension product line, and perhaps the best example of this is the RockShox Lyrik. The most obvious change they've made is they've made it bright red, which is a hat tip to their early suspension forks of the mid to late 90s. It's also available in 2 different fork offsets for each wheel size, which gives frame designers and also aftermarket customers some different options in terms of what handling and steering characteristics they want from their bike. Basically, a shorter offset will give you a slightly calmer steering feel, and a longer offset will give you a slightly quicker steering feel, as well as a slightly longer wheelbase. Recently, some bike brands like Transition and White have been stocking shorter fork offsets on their bikes. So it's interesting to see RockShox offering this not only to their OEM customers, but also to the aftermarket. And I think there's going to be a lot more brands in the future stocking shorter fork offsets on their bikes. There's also a new damper option. So as well as the RCT3, which offers low speed compression adjustment as well as a lockout, there's now another option, which is the RC2, which doesn't offer a lockout, but does offer both high and low speed compression adjustment. Now, the most important change they've made is to do with the air spring. Now, RockShox claim that there is somewhere between 51 and 86% less friction in the air spring, depending on how you measure it, whether it's stick slip or moving friction or static friction. Now, of course, these numbers only pertain to the friction inside the air spring, which is only a small percentage of the total friction in the fork. But reducing friction can only be a good thing in terms of suspension performance. The main difference between the old spring and this new debonair spring is that it has a larger negative spring volume. And in the Lyrik, they say it's about 42% larger negative air chamber. Now, why would you want that? Now, the main problem with air springs is that the spring rate actually decreases as you go from the start of the travel to the mid-stroke. So you have this problem that the suspension is reluctant to get moving at the start of the travel because it has a higher spring rate there, but then it kind of wallows towards the middle and towards the end of the stroke because it has the lowest spring rate in the middle of the stroke. So you get this kind of hammocky feeling where it sort of pushes through the middle of the travel. Now, a lot of companies, including RockShox with their debonair air shocks and Fox with their Evol air cans, and also third-party companies like Vorsprung suspension, have offered larger negative air chambers, which gives you a more constant spring rate as you go from the beginning to the mid-stroke. And you can still tune how much it ramps up towards the end, but you have a more consistent spring rate from kind of the start to the mid-stroke. So the purpose of the negative air chamber is to smoothen the transition as the suspension moves into its travel. And by increasing the size of that negative air chamber, you kind of prolong that effect into the stroke. So by enlarging the negative air chamber, you get a more coil-like feel to your air fork or shock. So the first thing I noticed when I was setting up this fork was that you need a bit more air pressure than you did with the old Lyrik. Because that negative air spring is bigger, you need more air pressure to get the same sag, but I also found that you needed fewer volume spaces because there's naturally a more gradual build-up of support through the stroke. So I ended up with just 1 volume spacer, whereas with the old Lyrik I would run 2 or even 3, and I was running about 108 psi, whereas I would run about 98 or 96 psi in the old fork. But despite running more pressure, it was really apparent from the get-go as soon as I started testing it that the way the fork sits into the initial part of the travel is much suppler, so it seems to sort of stick to the ground a bit better. But the support builds up much more gradually, so you get a more predictable, kind of composed feel when you hit things hard. The fork felt very supple and comfortable with lots of traction from that soft beginning stroke, but also I noticed I wasn't using a huge amount of travel. Now, last year I spent quite a lot of time testing the 2018 Lyrik against the Fox 36, the Fit 4 version. And what I found was that the 36 was suppler, offered more traction and more support. So I definitely preferred the Fox to the older Lyrik. So the first thing I wanted to do when I got to properly testing this fork was to compare it again to the 36. So I spent 2 really solid days doing this, The first day I went to one of my local test tracks, which is full of braking bumps and corners and roots and what have you. On that first day of testing, I found that the Lyrik felt a bit more composed and seemed to offer more traction, but the Fox felt a bit more lively. I did some timed runs and I couldn't really separate them. I was within about 2 seconds on each run on both forks. But then I did another day where I tested the Fox first and then the Lyrik second. And on that day, I much preferred the Lyrik. It seemed to offer a much calmer ride, much smoother on kind of loose, gnarly, rocky terrain, and especially at high speeds. It seemed to remain more composed and offered more traction. And I was going much faster on the Lyrik that time round. Now, it's not a perfect test because I was running the short offset version of the Lyrik, which could account for a lot of that extra composure and feeling of calmness. But I do think that the Lyrik seems to offer a softer beginning stroke and an even more gradual build-up of support. It also offers more damping adjustment, whereas the 36, I pretty much just left that damper fully open because it's pretty firm. So I found you pretty much have to run it fully open, and that works fine, but you don't really have much adjustability. Whereas with the Lyrik, if you run the high-speed compression in the middle of the range, it feels more or less like the old Lyrik. Having a high-speed compression adjuster is not necessarily a good thing in itself because it adds unnecessary complexity. But the Lyrik offers a very usable range of adjustment, where the middle setting feels pretty much the same as the old Lyrik or the RT3 version, and you can get a bit of leeway either side of that for if you want a more comfortable ride or a more supportive ride. After I had time to give the fork a really thorough comparative testing on my local trails that I know like the back of my hand, RockShox invited me out to New Zealand, presumably to see if the fork worked when it was upside down. When I was there, I got to race the NZ Enduro, which is a fantastic event, taking in some really tough and technical trails in the South Island of New Zealand. A lot of these stages were 15 minutes long, incredibly rough, rooty and slippery. When I was riding these really long physical stages, the ability to wind off a lot of compression and have a really comfortable feeling fork was really, really handy. Obviously I can't say for sure how another fork would compare on those specific stages, but the Lyrik felt like it was doing its job really, really well. So the new Lyrik is a big improvement over the old one, and it's a very good fork, but should you actually go out and buy one? Well, it costs just under £1,000 or $1,000 and just over 1,100 euros, which makes it about the same price, if not slightly cheaper, depending on where you live, than the equivalent Fox 36. But I think it's better than the equivalent Fox 36, and it's definitely better than the old Lyrik. And for my money, that makes it the best Enduro fork on the market right now. So if you have got that kind of cash to spend, I'd say this is the one to go for.